If you've been looking at the cover to your sermon notes this morning, you probably are saying, this is going to be a real downer of a sermon. After all, the titles on here, lonely, adversity, emotion, stressed, mental sadness, suffering, pain, depression. When you see all these different things on the front cover, you're probably saying, wow, I don't know if I want to be here or not. But when we look at this, I think there are several things that are common to the entire human race. Certainly, we all have physical bodies that are dependent upon proper food and proper hydration and rest and exercise. And we all want to love and to be loved. And we all, no matter who we are, eventually every one of us will come to the place that we deal with suffering. And it seems to us that some people, they go through and they're so blessed they hardly have any suffering. But when we see somebody and we think of them in that manner, remind yourself, we don't know what they're going through. We don't know what unseen things they are dealing with or how bad of a struggle that they themselves are having. And so when we look at this, there are times when we look at some people who are going through some very hard things in life, and we might ask the question, I don't know how they do it. I don't know how they get through it. But they might look at us and ask the same thing. You see, people today are dealing with physical suffering, mental suffering, emotional suffering, spiritual suffering, and even suffering that is going on in their life, their mind, their body, their spirit, that they can't even define or say what the problem really is. But as Paul wrote to the church at Rome, he was well aware that suffering is a major challenge to the entire human race. And so because suffering is such a major concern, Paul dedicated a portion here of Romans chapter 8 to the topic of suffering that we deal with in this life. And certainly this is not a subject that I would address very often, but as it comes up in our text here in verses 18 to 30, I thought I would spend 3 weeks on this theme here of the suffering that we go through on this earth. And so when we look at this, again, when I was in Bible college, I was told at that time that in any congregation at any time, that there are usually at least 1 out of every 6 people who are suffering, who are in pain, or who are in mental anguish, people who are dealing with things that we don't even know that they're dealing with. And more recent figures have upped this from 1 out of every 6 to more recent figures would say 1 out of every 5. And there are some who have said that because we are so private about our suffering and the things we're going through, that oftentimes we don't want everyone to know that maybe a more actual figure is that 1 out of every 4 people are dealing with some issues and are suffering at the present time. So if you look at it in that manner, then in this congregation today, we have probably at least 4 to 6 people who are going through things that maybe the rest of us aren't even aware of. Things where there is suffering and pain and sorrow and all kinds of things that they may never have even shared with us. And so this morning, in the next few weeks, I want us to go through this theme of the glory to come, God's purpose in suffering. And this is kind of a mini-series within the series in the book of Romans. And so today I want us to see the suffering of the present age. Next week I want us to go on and to see the groaning of the saints of God. And then in 2 weeks' time, as we bring this mini-series to a close, I want us to look at the purpose of God in our suffering. And so the first thing I want to see is that of the reality of suffering in this life. Paul does not minimize our suffering. He puts it in a context. Sometimes we question our suffering and why am I going through this? And sometimes we just really feel awful. But in verse 18 he said, "For I consider that the sufferings of this present time are not comparing with the glory that is to be revealed to us. Now, this morning I want to say that suffering is a universal experience to the human race. At some point, or at many points, or for even much of our life, that the entire human race will suffer. Now, you might not suffer at the same time I do. You may not suffer in the same way I do. But every one of us throughout our lives will suffer. We will suffer physical pain. We will suffer mental anguish, emotional pain, loneliness. We will suffer all kinds of things throughout life. And ever since sin entered into this world in the Garden of Eden, man has had to deal with suffering in the human race. And even though that is true, it is sometimes hard for us to take in. And when we are suffering, sometimes we tend to think, well, I'm the only one who's ever gone through this. I'm the only one who's ever dealt with this. Or the way I'm dealing with this is harder than what my neighbor is dealing with, or my fellow person who sits in the pew or behind me or in front of me. I'm dealing with something harder than they have to deal with. You see, sometimes when we are suffering, that we kind of blind ourselves to others, and all we can see is me, that the spotlight is on us saying, I am suffering. I need help. Now, we've all heard the joke of that you can have either a cold or you can have a man cold. Now, as a member of the male gender, I'm going to defend the men this morning. But as we look at this, that very implication of a man cold, it's an implication that men, when they get sick, are big babies. That men like to be babied and pitied and have the whole world think that what they're experiencing is worse than what you've experienced or what anyone else has experienced. And while I can defend the male gender this morning, not having a wife or anything to speak the other side of it, I can tell you whatever I want about how I deal with suffering and sickness. And there's no one here to contradict that and say he's really a big wuss when it comes to suffering or sickness. But to be honest, I think there is something in every one of us where we like to be babied when we are sick in some way. And something about every one of us that we feel that what we are going through is worse than what others are going through. And we might even magnify our suffering and sickness in order to get pity from those around us. But it's not just the human race that has to suffer. All of creation suffers. The world around us is suffering. The ground beside us here is suffering. Every part of the world is suffering just as we are. And that's something we don't always realize. But every part of creation was put under a curse because of the sin of man. And our world around us has no choice. We'll hear of tsunamis, we'll hear of earthquakes, we'll hear of volcanoes, we'll hear of all these things. The whole world around us is under a curse, and yet the world here has not done anything. The world has not gone against God. It's man who has gone against God. But God has put a curse on the entire human race and on the entire creation that he has made because of man's sin. And creation's groaning. If you look down verse 22 of our text, it says, for we know that the whole creation has been groaning together in the pains of childbirth until now. Now it's a metaphor for longing and uses the picture of a woman with childbirth as a picture of the suffering and pain that the whole world is dealing with. Now, again, when we look at this, days or weeks before a woman will go into labor to have a baby, there's what's called false labor, or we may know it better as Braxton Hicks contractions. And this isn't the real deal, but it feels like the real deal. This isn't the real labor pains for the birth of the baby, but it's the pre-pains that come. And it's something to prepare the woman and her body and her mind for what's coming and the pain that's going to be there in childbirth. And Paul says in verse 22 that the whole earth, the whole world, has been like a woman in the pains of childbirth that is groaning the whole world around us. because the whole world is experiencing the curse that has come because of sin. And so we look at this, and when the real labor pains come with a woman, they start off slow. It might be relatively mild pain at first, and the contractions might be an hour apart or more. And then the contractions get closer and closer, and they last longer and longer and become more and more intense. And as the time comes close to the birth of the baby, the woman is really having the real thing in the pain. And, sometimes it makes me appreciate being a man that I don't get to experience that. And I know you women can condemn me afterwards for saying that, but I'm sure every man here feels the same way I do on it. But when we look at it, when the time of delivering comes near, the suffering becomes more intense. And Paul says that this whole world we live in is in the pains of childbirth as a woman who is getting ready to have a baby. And it's waiting, for the time that something happens. And with a woman, we know what's going to happen. We know that eventually those pains are going to result in a new life, a new beautiful baby boy or girl coming into this world. But when this world is going to split apart, and all of a sudden a new earth come out of the midst of that. But the world around us is groaning and it's suffering, and it's waiting for the day that God will reveal his children. The day that his sons and his daughters will be revealed in glory, because the day that God brings us into glory is the day that this earth will be renewed, and the groaning and the suffering that this earth now has, it will be done and it will be renewed. The world constantly testifies that something is wrong and broken. When we hear of earthquakes, when we hear of tsunamis, when we hear of all these things that they were not naturally there in the beginning of the world, but they've come onto this world because of the curse. But that groaning is purposeful. Now, a woman, when she's going through the pains of child labor, it seems awful at the time, but there's a purpose to it. And that's one of the things that every woman knows, is that there is a purpose to the pain, that eventually it's going to come into something very beautiful in your life. See, the groaning anticipates renewal, not destruction. And just as the groaning of the woman in labor awaits the purpose of a new arrival, so also the world we live in is groaning with purpose, waiting for the day that God will bring his people into glory. And that groaning is hopeful. It's hopeful because one day God will do something both in the human beings and in the world around us. See, creation awaits liberation when God's children are glorified. If you look down with me to Romans 8, verse 19, it says, "For the creation waits with the eager longing for the revealing of the sons of God." And then go down to verse 29, that the creation itself will be set free from its bondage to corruption and obtain the freedom of the glory of the children of God. For we know that the whole creation has been groaning together in the pains of childbirth until now. And that very day when God glorifies his people, when he gives us a new body, a new mind, a new spirit, it's going to be a time when he will also liberate the world around us from the bondage it has. And on that day there will be a new heaven and a new earth. Everything around us that is sick and diseased, that is full of the ground around us that has weeds and has harmful insects that will harm your crops. God is going to purify this whole earth. He's going to make everything new. And at that time, all creation, you and I included, will be perfect. And we will be that for all of eternity. So how do we compare the suffering of this age with the glory that's to be revealed? Well, if you look down in your text here, verse 18, it says, "For I consider that the sufferings of this present time are not comparing with the glory that is to be revealed to us." Now, basically, Paul in this verse is using an accounting term. Some of you may take your income tax to an accountant. And if you do, one of the things that sometimes the accountant if you have a figure there of $542.87, they might just round it up and put on the line $543. Many times they overlook the smaller change and just go with the rounding it up or rounding it down. And the same thing in our currency. In 2012, Canada got rid of the penny. And so now we are used to either rounding up our purchases or rounding them down, depending on which side of the three they fall. But Paul said that I don't consider the present sufferings worth comparing. Again, he's not speaking of finances, but he's using financial terms. We can't even compare what we have now with the glory that is to be revealed in us. Now, again, when we look at this, Paul is just saying that glory outweighs suffering, and I don't understand that. As somebody who has never yet been glorified in heaven in a heavenly body, I do not understand how we can come to the place that we'll say, everything I've endured on this earth, the suffering, the pain, the sorrow, everything I've had in this earth, why, that was just trivial, it was nothing. Because right now, when we are going through things, our pain, our sorrow, our suffering, it consumes every part of who we are, and we can't see how anything can be any bigger than what we are going through. And we can't imagine that there could ever be a time we'd look at it as trivial. But Paul says that what God has waiting for us in glory is so much greater than anything that we are experiencing now, that they will say, wow, I thought I was suffering back then. I thought that was a terrible day for me. I remember all those years that I spent in agony and suffering and pain and misery. And we're going to look back and say, wow, I thought that was a big deal. That was nothing. When I look at what God has given me, how could I ever think I was suffering in that day? Now, we don't understand that from our present scene, but one day what we have suffered in this life will be nothing compared to the glory that Jesus Christ has for us to partake of. I want you to turn with me to 2 Corinthians a moment. 2 Corinthians chapter 4. 2 Corinthians chapter 4, verses 16 through 18. And there have been times that I have preached out of this passage of Scripture when I've had a funeral of somebody maybe with cancer or some other sickness or disease who has had unbearable suffering. But in verses 16 to 18 it says here, so we do not lose heart, though our outer self is wasting away. Our inner self is being renewed day by day. For this light momentary affliction is preparing for us an eternal weight of glory beyond all comparison. As we look not to the things that are seen, but to the things that are unseen. For the things that are seen are transient, but the things that are unseen are eternal. Now, Paul speaks of our light and our momentary struggles and suffering. Now, I've been into many hospital rooms with a great many patients who have been suffering and suffering immensely. I have seen cancer patients and other patients who the pain and agony they were in, they would receive very high doses of morphine to make it so that they could just endure the present suffering that they were going through. And I know when my stepfather was dying of cancer, that at the time the pain specialist doctor came in one day and he said to us that the amount of morphine that my stepfather was receiving was a heavy enough dose that it would kill most heavy drug addicts. But with him it was going directly to the pain he was suffering rather than merely to his body. And so again, when we look at this, I've never seen a day when I was in with him that he or any of the many other patients I've seen in great suffering and agony have said, oh, this is just a light affliction, just momentary illness, no big deal. Because when people are going through the pain and suffering in this life, those times like this are the biggest, most terrible things in their lives. And they seem like they will never end, and there's no end to the pain and suffering. And many times in life, that's what it is that there are times when, excuse me, times when it seems that our suffering and our sorrow and our pain is bigger than what we could even handle. But Paul says that the scale tips infinitely towards the glory. Glory is something that is certain. Regardless of what we are suffering, we have on this earth, it will not even begin to compare with the glory of what God has for us in heaven. In heaven, the glory of God will be a certainty that is greater than anything that we have suffered in this life. In heaven, we will realize this, that glory is greater than pain and suffering. You see, the suffering we might endure in this life, it's temporary. The suffering in this life is only for a time, but God's glory is eternal. And at the most, the suffering we have in this life, it might endure for a few weeks, few months, few years, maybe even in some cases for a few decades. But when we have been in heaven for a millennium, 1,000 years, or maybe 10,000 years, or 100,000 years, or maybe some other figure, and we think back on our pain, what is a few years in our life on this earth? What is what we might have suffered in maybe even a decade or so of our life? I mean, I am reminded of one lady back home. She just died a few years ago, was in her late 70s, early 80s. But when that lady was about 24, 25 years old, she had a very major stroke. And from that day until the day she died in her late 70s or early 80s, she was a woman who was paralyzed. I think she had the use of her hands, but her legs did not have a lot of use. I can't imagine 50, 70 years of enduring what she did and of the suffering. But Paul tells us that even somebody who has gone through something like that in heaven, that after a time in heaven, going to look back and say, wow, I really suffered and I thought I was doing something terrible then. That was nothing. What God has given me now is so much greater than the suffering I thought was so bad at that time. You see, glory is transformative. It changes not only us, but the entire created order. And there will be a transformation of the body. Mortality will be replaced with immortality. I mean, right now, we are living in mortality. I mean, as I look around this room, about half of us in this room have eyeglasses. I'm not going to open your mouth to see, but probably a large number also have dentures. There are, I know like Derek and I both have artificial hips, and maybe others here also have stuff like that. But when we look at all these different things, they seem like such big deals on this earth. But in heaven and in glory, there's going to come a time we're going to say, wow, I thought I was suffering then. That was nothing. Now, we can't imagine that today, and with the things that we might be going through now, whether it's physical, mental, emotional, spiritual, whatever kind of pain or suffering we might have. But that day is coming when God has better things in store for us. And, we wonder what it would be like to live in bodies that didn't have heart disease or diabetes or bad joints and worn out bodies and breathing issues. And we could go on, list 100 different ailments that people suffer from today. But in heaven, we're going to look back and say, wow, that was nothing. I thought it was a big deal then, but it was nothing. Scripture tells us that one day there will be new heavens and a new earth. Revelation chapter 21, verses 1 to 4 speaks on this. In Revelation 21, 1 to 4, God's word said, "Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth. For the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and the sea was no more. And I saw the holy city, the new Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride adorned for her husband. And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, Behold, the dwelling place of God is with man. He will dwell with them, and they will be his people, and God himself will be with them as their God. He will wipe away every tear from their eyes, and death shall be no more, neither shall there be mourning, nor crying, nor pain any more, for the former things have been passed away. I don't know about you, but I'm waiting for that day. I'm excited for the day when I hear that proclamation from heaven that says, death, sorrow, pain, disease, sickness, all these things, they're just a memory of the past. I look forward to hearing those words from heaven, saying that you'll never experience any of that again. You know, everything, including us, will be made new. Suffering and pain will just be a vague memory that we remembered way, way, way back in the long, far way. But it doesn't even seem real to us now. That's what it's going to be like in heaven. That's what it's going to be like when the pain and sorrow and hard times of this earth are done. And we will see God as he is. I can't even imagine that. I can't imagine what it's going to be to see God face to face. 128 years ago, a woman by the name of Carrie Ellis Breck wrote a song called Face to Face. And the third verse of that song says these words, What rejoicing in his presence when are banished grief and pain, when the crooked ways are straightened and the dark things shall be plain. And then the chorus of that song goes, Face to face I shall behold him, far beyond the starry sky. Face to face in all his glory, I shall see him by and by. Now today we've looked just a little bit, given an overview of the reality of suffering in this life. And that we have to experience it in this life. And some in this room may have experienced a great deal of suffering in your life through the years. Others here may be fortunate enough that you have not had to endure as much. But whether it be small or great, every one of us in this life experienced suffering. And regardless what you have suffered in this life, we are reminded of a great truth about suffering. And that is, whatever we suffer in this life will not even begin to compare with the glory we will have in heaven. The next 2 weeks, I want to continue looking at this theme of suffering. Next week, we're going to go on out of verses 23 to 27 of Romans 8, and looking at the groaning of the saints of God. And then in 2 weeks from now, the last Sunday of this month, I want us to look at verses 28 to 30 of our text to see the purpose of God in all things, including our suffering. Our closing hymn this morning,
129.
129.